happy to try to take some questions if anybody has any.
How is this more onerous than what Georgia and Indiana has done? What are some examples that make this more enforced than those?
It's my understanding that this bill does not include student IDs. This bill does not allow for expired driver's license. So, for example, many senior citizens who have old driver's license can't use those. I think those are two of the reasons why it's more onerous. Is anybody who's in the committee? Those are the main. I think those are the main two.
Do you know what happened to the court challenges to the Georgia and Indiana laws?
In Indiana, the Supreme Court of the United States upheld the voter ID law, but was very specific. Said that in order for a voter photo ID law to be constitutional, they have to meet certain requirements. Perhaps the key requirement there was that the government-issued IDs have to be freely available at no cost, and it specifically noted that an indigency, to require proof of indigency, is not sufficient under the Constitution. And there were other requirements that are not satisfied in this bill as well.
So in Indiana, to clarify, in Indiana you don't have to be indigent to get an ID? No,
in Indiana, yes, I believe that's accurate. I believe that in Indiana everybody can get a free voter ID.
The 25% African American figure, that don't have state IDs, where does that come from?
I believe that comes from the Advancement Project and the Brennan Center both.
You know, a lot of people who have IDs, they're probably looking at this situation saying, we have a driver's license, we have ID with us all the time, why can't these people get IDs? Can you tell us what the barriers are that the people that you're talking about that don't have IDs, and why it's tough for them to get and get IDs?
Yeah, people who drive and have driver's license and tend to be more wealthy don't necessarily understand the problems that poor people have in this state, or minorities in many cases have in this state. There are costs to get a government-issued ID. First of all, if you have to prove indigency, who knows what's going to be required? And of course, you got to take time off. You know, you have to swear a certificate that you're homeless. I mean, I don't know what the requirements would be. The bill doesn't state it. But in addition, there's costs. You have to have a birth certificate or something else. Birth certificates cost $21. To buy a state ID itself in Ohio is $8.50. And if anybody has dealt with government agencies, you know how difficult it can be. It's not a matter of getting on the phone, calling up, send me my state issued ID. You probably have to take a day or two off of work. Poor people can't do that. And then, of course, there's nothing in this bill about voter education. So, we're looking at a situation where we have a major vote coming up in November. There will be the referendum on Senate Bill 5. How many people are even going to know, how many poor people, that they have to have a government-issued photo ID? And there's nothing in this bill about going out and educating potential voters and telling them about it and training people at the board of voter boards and at the motor vehicle bureaus and other places. Nothing in the bill.
Is there a fallback provision that somebody who shows up at the polls without an ID can get a provisional ballot?
Yes, but then they have to come back in 10 days with their photo ID. Which, by the way, can take weeks to get a photo ID.
If an ID was freely available in Ohio as it is in other states you mentioned, you wouldn't have to prove this indigency. Would the bill be less objectionable?
Well, I'll tell you what's less objectionable is what we have today. Today we have a system that's working just fine. We have a system that says you can have a photo ID, or you can have a utility bill, or a variety of other things. Those provisions were passed when Secretary of State Houston was the Speaker of the Ohio House. He hasn't come out and said that's a problem. In fact, I wonder where he was yesterday. Oh, I know, he was out here on the steps.
Doesn't the bill allow people to use those forms of ID if they're voting by mail, absentee? Why isn't that enough to give someone an opportunity to vote?
That's a good question. If we had more time and maybe some hearings, maybe somebody would have asked that. And maybe we could have gotten an
It was
answer.
asked.
Yeah, it was asked, okay. It just wasn't answered.
On the cost issue, I heard Representative Clyde, I think, say 20 million. I think Representative Hurd referenced 10 million in Indiana. Where did those numbers come from in terms of the 10 and the 20?
The 10 million I referenced was from the fiscal note provided in committee.
Is it Indiana fiscal note?
It's from our fiscal
Oh,
note,
okay.
referencing the cost for Indiana.
Okay. What about the 20 million?
There was a fiscal note, let me also say, there was a fiscal note for a proposed Missouri law that estimated a cost of $6 million for the first year and $4 million every year after that. Indiana had an estimate of similar substantial costs when their law was considered, and as you know, Missouri and Indiana are both significantly smaller states than Ohio.
And Aaron, just to clarify,
Yeah.
the $10 million was just for the issuance of the ID card and didn't count the extensive costs for voter education that were done in Indiana and for poll worker training. And Indiana is much smaller than Ohio, so our costs would be much more substantial. It also doesn't take into consideration the litigation costs, because this law, as proposed, 159, is unconstitutional. And I bet that there will be significant litigation costs for the state.
So when you speak of 20 million, are you wrapping all that into that number?
We got an estimate from some outside groups helping us that it would be a minimum of 20 million, including the free ID cards, the voter education, and the poll worker training. And I think that's a lowball number because I think the litigation costs will be extensive.
And again, if this bill hadn't been rushed through in a week, we might have more answers to these questions. And by the way, just to follow up on the question with the Indiana law, the requirements that the Supreme Court laid down included, first, that photo IDs be made available free of charge for all who don't have one, and the states cannot limit the free IDs to a show of indigency. So House Bill 159 fails on that requirement. Photo IDs, the second requirement, photo IDs have to be readily accessible to all voters without any undue burden. So at a minimum, Ohio would have to expand the number of ID issuing offices and extend their operating hours, and again, House Bill 159 fails on that requirement. Third, Ohio would have to adopt a program to undertake substantial voter outreach and public education efforts. That was part of the Supreme Court decision, so that they could ensure voters are apprised of the law's requirements and the procedures for obtaining photo IDs. And again, House Bill 159 fails on that requirement. And when you look at what it would cost to do all those things, that's where you get the significant costs.
A question for Representative Clyde. You talked about your amendment dealing with student IDs. Would an ID issued by a public university be considered a government-issued ID?
The answer is no. That's why college students are so discriminated against in this bill. Young adults are discriminated against in this bill. College IDs don't count.
One more question?
One of the things that supporters have said is that it would keep people from double voting or jumping from precinct to precinct. I know you guys are saying there's been documented cases of that. But what in the current setup would prevent someone from doing that? The way things are now.
Nothing in the current bill would stop that from happening. But you don't need me over there. There is nothing in the current bill that would prevent that from happening.
The way it is today.
There isn't anything in the current law. What you have to realize, and it's been said very, very well, this is a solution looking for a problem. Every single one of your parents voted by signing their name. Your parents never had to show an ID ever. They walked up, the book was open, they signed their name, they walked into the booth, and they moved levers. That's the way we voted for decades. This is nonsense. Underline the word nonsense. We do not need to do this we don't need to spend this money. We don't need to put our people through this kind of problem. We don't have poll workers trained for this, and we don't have court systems that are ready to take on this burden. This is not something that needs to be done, especially in one day.
Last question.
Do you think this...
Let me just, because Kathleen was at the hearing also, and I think, talk about the existing law. What prevents it now?
And I think it's important to get at that is not possible today. A voter shows up at their polling location and has to sign in. They have to be an eligible registered voter. If they're not, and if they've already voted once, they sign the poll book, so they can't come back again and sign the poll book. If they tried to vote in another location, they'd have to vote a provisional ballot, and there's systems in place to make sure that that provisional ballot cast in another location would not be counted. So that's impossible under current law, and this bill does nothing to address that.
Do you think this bill
And it's not failing, that's the point. It's not a problem today. It's not a problem. I read all your papers and magazines and everything else. I don't see anything in there that this is a problem. It's not been a problem.
Do you think this bill would have been introduced if Senate Bill 5 wasn't expected to be on the ballot?
That's a very good question. I think that this bill could possibly be influenced by Senate Bill 5. It could possibly be influenced because we have the first African-American president up for re-election in 2012. Thank you all very much for coming.